Slavery is back.
Welcome to a place where private business profit from a captive labour force, yet pennies are spent on medical services to a population in which the Indigenous, the poor and the mentally ill are overrepresented. Where isolation, humiliation and degradation are facts of life. Welcome to prison.
It depends who's telling the story, I suppose. The prisoners would have one view, the people who work in the prison system would have another, and I think it's up to people to decide where the truth is.
Give government propaganda and the media spin doctors the flick. And check out Doin Time for news, views and tunes on prison issues from Guantanamo Bay to Christmas Island to prisons and detention centres everywhere. Every Monday at 4 p.m. on your community radio 3CR.
We are still fired up and we're still talking about revolution.
Hello and welcome to the Doin Time show. This is 3CR Community Radio, 855 AM on the dial, streaming live on www.3cr.org.au. This is Marisa and I'll be taking you through until 5 o'clock this evening. And this is actually going to be a very, very important show, and it's in regards to a shining tribute to our very much loved and honourable Uncle Ray Jackson. And he died on the 23rd of April 2015. He's an Aboriginal warrior who dedicated his life to fighting against the deaths of his people in Australian police and prison cell, and succumbed quietly to his own death in his small flat in Waterloo. Jackson, the president of the Indigenous Social Justice Association, who has tirelessly accumulated thousands of pages of testimony relating to the violence perpetuated by the criminal justice system against Aboriginals and others in Australia. Ray Jackson was a Wiradjuri warrior for human rights and was one of Australia's most vocal and knowledgeable deaths in custody campaigners, a fighter for justice, or FKJ as he always signed his weekly emails. Jackson spent nearly 30 years holding our police, prison and court systems to account every time a blackfella died in custody. Ray Jackson also did a lot of work for refugees and asylum seekers. And just before I introduce our guest, I wanted to also say that when funding for the Aboriginal Deaths in Custody Watch Committee, for whom Jackson had worked since 1987, that funding was cut in 1997, which was the worst year on record for deaths in prison custody. Jackson moved the entire operation into his one-bedroom flat and founded the Indigenous Social Justice Association to continue its work. And Uncle also received a French government award, and that certainly in Australia, which has a long history of atrocities, never actually allocated an award to him. Now, I just wanted to put listeners in context of what has happened, because this year I think is a little bit different to other past memorial shows. The Doin Time show has played an integral part in honouring warriors, Aboriginal warriors that have died, and also looking at Aboriginal deaths in custody. This year we have one guest on our show, and that's going to be Joseph Pugliese, who has been a friend of Ray Jackson and has assisted him with doing a lot of work in regards to deaths in custody, and has written several books. Listeners may recall that we actually did some work last week in regards to a book launch that's coming up, Mapping Deathscapes, Digital Geographies of Racial and Border Violence. Now, Joseph will be with us today, and we were meant to be interviewing also Carolyn Jackson, who is the daughter of Ray. Carolyn actually had to cancel at the last minute because of ill health. There is a lot going on in her life, and she has asked me to say this on air. She has asked me to tell listeners that she will be available to speak to us in 2 weeks. So this broadcast is actually going to be a 2-part series to honour Ray, and Joseph and I have discussed this, and Carol and I has also discussed it as well. And so today we will be speaking with Joseph in regards to Ray's life's work, and we will celebrate his life with Joseph talking about the Deathscapes project and how that was actually, in a way, Ray was a really big part of it. Well, not in a way, he was a big part of it in regards to countless other Indigenous contributors. And then in 2 weeks, so this Monday on Anzac Day, which is fitting because Ray did a lot of work on the Frontier Wars as well, the show is airing from 4 till 5. And then the Monday after that, I will be interviewing Carolyn as a second part of the series, and also Bronwyn, Auntie Bronwyn as well, Professor Bronwyn Carlson, who is a contributor of Mapping Deathscapes. So I will be interviewing 2 very strong and powerful Indigenous women about Uncle Ray, namely his daughter Carolyn and also Professor Bronwyn Carlson. But I think that Joseph very soon will be giving a very fitting introduction and celebration of his work. Welcome, Joseph.
Welcome, Marisa, and thanks for your warm introduction. And before I go any further, I'd like to acknowledge that I'm speaking from Gadigal lands here, unceded sovereignty of Gadigal lands, and that as a settler diasporic subject, I'm fully aware of what that means. And I don't say this in a rhetorical manner precisely because it will tie into the issuing of Aboriginal passport ceremonies that Uncle Ray initiated some years ago. I'd also like to give my best wishes to Carolyn Jackson, Uncle Ray's daughter, who I, of course, have known over a number of years, and I'm concerned to hear that she's not in a particularly good place at the moment. So all my love and good wishes to Carolyn, and also to the brilliant Bronwyn Carlson, the colleague at Macquarie University, who will be speaking with you in a couple of weeks' time. Thanks, Marisa.
Thank you, Joseph. And you know, this is no secret. It's good to speak on air about these things because we're not always in a good place. Yes. And, you know, Carolyn and I were discussing whether or not we should actually let the show go ahead this year. And I said to Carolyn, well, should we cancel it? And she said, absolutely not. She said, I want to honour my father. So here we are.
Yes. And it's always an honour to speak about Uncle Ray Jackson at any time.
Okay, so let's talk about Ray. And when was he born?
I don't quite know when Uncle Ray was born, but I can tell you about the particulars of his life.
Yes.
If you know that I got to know in terms of the work that we did collaboratively.
Here we are, the 27th of March, 1941. Sorry, the 27th of March, 1941.
Right.
So let's talk about his life. I mean, what do you think are the most important aspects?
Look, I
there
think
are many.
Yeah, we can work through them, but I guess now that you've brought up his birth date, we need to mark what a harrowing early years Uncle Ray had, and I know Carolyn Jackson will talk to this in more detail when you speak to her.
Yes.
But one of the facts we can't but name is that he was a child of the stolen generations, and that as a tender toddler, he was removed from his Indigenous mother, his Wiradjuri mother, and that left a profound trauma on Uncle Ray, and it shaped really his burning desire to achieve social justice for Indigenous people, but for all other people who are victims of state violence.
Absolutely. And Carolyn usually talks about that, so I'm glad that we're able to talk about that. He didn't even know his own name. He didn't know his birth family.
That's exactly right. And I know Carolyn has shared this information before, and no doubt she'll do it again because it's important information. Uncle Ray Jackson was really the strongest person and the bravest person I've ever known. And I say that absolutely sincerely. There is so much to cover in terms of what he did, but, you know, to give you an example of his fearlessness, one of the revolutionary things, and we're not going to work through his life chronologically, we'll be jumping here and there because it's all interconnected, but one of the revolutionary things he did, one of the most important interventions he made was when, with the forensic pathologist Carl Hughes, he actually argued that all autopsies of Indigenous deaths in custody should be attended either by a member of the family or a representative of the family, so as to ensure that the autopsy was conducted with ceremony and respect in terms of the dead loved one of the Indigenous family. And when he first put that proposal forward to the coroner and to the police, they actually laughed at him and said it's not going to happen. And as you know, it did happen, and he turned that into legislation. And he, with Carl Hughes, would often attend, at the request of the family, the autopsies of Indigenous deaths in custody. And Carl said, Carl was a seasoned forensic pathologist, and he trained in those sorts of procedures. And he said he couldn't quite believe the strength of Uncle Ray, that he would front to those really confronting situations where he'd have to witness, the dissection of a loved one's body. But he did that out of love and respect for the family, and out of a sense of honour for the death in custody. And so I marked that. He was an incredibly brave and fearless man in that way. But Carolyn has mentioned to me on a number of occasions that the time that Uncle Ray would fall over, he would get emotional, quietly but profoundly emotional, was when he would talk about being a member of the stolen generation and the fact that he never got to see his mother.
Absolutely. And that's been written about quite a lot. He's been very open about that, Joseph.
He has. He would talk about that. And I think putting it in the public domain was important for a lot of reasons, but most obviously because clearly there isn't an Indigenous family in this settler country who's not been touched by the stolen generations. And Indigenous families who had lost their loved ones through the violence of the state carceral system, the prison system, the so-called criminal justice system, knew that he wasn't someone who was standing on the outside of their trauma. He had personally experienced his own profound trauma, and thus they could immediately sense the profound empathy that he had for their situation, for their loss, for their grieving, and their burning desire to achieve justice.
Absolutely, absolutely. And, we've often worked alongside Ray, and he had his beloved ISJA and his beloved Redfern as well. Yes.
Well, ISJA was really one of the most important social justice organisations this country has seen. And, of course, as you mentioned in your introduction, Uncle Ray was foundational in founding it with, let me add, the wonderful Don Clark, who actually went to the Élysée Palace in Paris, France, when Uncle Ray was awarded, and ISJA were awarded the French Human Rights Medal, which, as you know, is an incredibly prestigious human rights award, and recipients have included people like Nelson Mandela. So they worked hand in hand, Don Clark and Uncle Ray, in founding ISJA and in keeping it running in their pursuit for social justice. And, of course, all of that was carried out, as you said, from a one-bedroom flat in Waterloo Towers, public housing in Waterloo Towers, but also in the terrain of Redfern, which was really, has always been like one of the epicentres of Aboriginal activism, as you know, going back to the late 60s and early 70s, foundational place for Indigenous activism that saw the establishment of the Aboriginal Legal Service, Aboriginal Medical Service, etc. So Uncle Ray was fully at home and supportive of the community there. And as you know, I mean, you mentioned how he died quietly, and, we can say that he died after doing the rounds of Redfern and going to express his solidarity and support with the Tent Embassy there, because at the time they were fighting the overtake of Redfern Indigenous lands for a whole new building development, which was effectively going to erase the block. And he did those rounds and then went back and, literally died quietly in his bed. So Redfern was really in his blood.
Absolutely, and I feel that today is really important to really recount some of that historical context, because often what tends to happen when someone passes away, whether that be a campaigner, whether that be a loved one, they look at the current things, but the history is never looked at. And I think with Ray, it's really important to look at what the history of some of what he's done, especially in regards to the history of black deaths in custody.
Yeah. And look, I mean, what we can say now, if we're unfolding this history, is that Uncle Ray didn't come to social justice suddenly and abruptly. Ever since he began to sort of work in any sort of sphere, he was driven by social justice, by the desire to achieve social justice outcomes. And I can give you an update on a part of the history that I wasn't particularly familiar with, and which sort of came to me just recently because I was contacted by one of his old trade union activists, Sergio Zorino. They worked at the Clyde oil refinery here in Sydney. And the important thing that Sergio Zorino is doing, he's writing a biographical account of Uncle Ray's life across the arc of his whole career. And it's going to be for a book on Indigenous trade union activists. And what Sergio Zorino told me was that, in effect, when Uncle Ray was working at the Clyde oil refinery, he was at the forefront of the trade union movement to get better rights, better conditions for all workers. And basically, he learned his skills in terms of being a tactician, in terms of developing new policies and agendas to improve worker conditions and rights in a really tough environment, as you can imagine, where he was fighting the big bosses, the big capitalist bosses. And often he would be the representative that the trade union movement would send to, say, arbitration, and he would argue his case and win better conditions. Often, to the surprise of his fellow workers who said, "Oh, you won't be able to win this, mate," but he did, and that was really a sign of his acute intelligence, but also his extraordinary legal and persuasive skills to get his case across. So you can see that he really cut his teeth, as Sergio mentioned to me, in a really tough environment on the Sydney waterfront, if you like, at the Clyde oil refinery. So right from his roots, there's always been a social justice activist for all. And that's important because we all know, of course, Uncle Ray for his extraordinary work in the domain of Indigenous deaths in custody, a harrowing wound in this country that's not been resolved, that continues to escalate. He was there fighting for a halt, not only for justice, but a halt to Indigenous deaths in custody, which is why, he was there as the founding secretary of the Custody Watch Committee in 1987, as you mentioned. And then when he was unhappy with the work that was doing, because it really wasn't fulfilling the objectives that he saw as crucial, he did found with Don Clark the Indigenous Social Justice Association. But you can see how right from the start, Uncle Ray had a broader vision of social justice. Of course, his primary aim, and rightly so, was to achieve justice for his people, for Indigenous people in this country, whose sovereignty has been violated, their lands have been violated by the settler colonial state. But he also had a large internationalist, socialist vision of justice, which was really encompassing all people who were if you like, at risk because of the violence of the state. And I'm not sure if you'd like me to talk more about that, because I certainly could.
Absolutely. I mean, it's important. It's interesting because Carolyn and I were just having a chat off air. We're going to be hoping to invite Sergio onto the show in a couple of weeks. She was talking about him about half an hour ago to me.
Oh, excellent. Yeah.
So this is a really good lead-up. When Sergio
contacted me, I said, you really need to contact Carolyn. We spoke with Carolyn. And so, this is getting bigger than Ben-Hur, which is good to hear.
Yeah, and it's really
multiple
fantastic.
Perspectives on Uncle Ray's life.
Yeah, because I was going to ask you about that. So, yeah, I mean, are there any other comments that you'd like to add to that?
Well, I think that work with his fellow socialists at the Clyde Oil Refinery gave him a unique perspective on the fact that you need to work with and create alliances with all other people who are at the receiving end of state violence. And I think the unique feature of Uncle Ray was that he was an internationalist. He was an Indigenous activist who, if you like, followed in a long tradition where they could see that the process of decolonisation was a transnational movement, and Uncle Ray was passionately engaged with other Indigenous communities overseas. He always was following what was happening in North America, in Canada, in other settler states like Canada, the US, but also in places like colonised Palestine. He was a passionate advocate of justice for the Palestinians, precisely because their lands have been occupied and usurped by the Israeli settler colonial state. And he was absolutely fearless in speaking about that. And I want to broach and pause a moment and invoke some of Uncle Ray's words, because I'm not sure if our listeners have been following, but there's been pretty shocking escalation of violence in the last few weeks in Palestine, in occupied East Jerusalem, dozens of Palestinian activists killed. And Uncle Ray followed that because he could see that their situation mirrored the situation of the settler colonial state in Australia. And I've got this powerful quote that he sent out in one of his newsletters in 2014, just after the Israeli state launched Operation Protective Edge, which saw thousands of Palestinian civilians killed, and really, in Gaza, the destruction of civil infrastructure like schools, hospitals, ambulances, mosques, places of worship, etc. And he basically sent out a missive saying, and I'm going to quote Uncle Ray's words, he says, "It is far too long that the genocidal attacks against the civilian population of Gaza must stop, and stop immediately. It now appears that the Netanyahu government is in an all-out war of extermination of the Palestinian people. Israel must stop this overkill. That is just a fact that must be done. What must be possible, no, certain, is that the ethnocide of the Palestinians in Gaza must cease once and for all." End of quote. That's Uncle Ray's words from his ISJA newsletter on the 31st of July 2014. And that internationalist vision he had, and the passion that he had for all other people who are the victims of settler state violence, you can see that it was transnational in its reach. And when he conducted his really landmark, all-important Aboriginal passport ceremonies, which we can talk about more in detail now, he actually sent, as through an emissary, through a representative, Aboriginal passports to Palestinians in the refugee camps in Lebanon and in occupied Palestine as a sign of Indigenous solidarity with their situation.
Absolutely, and indeed, I believe that Robbie Thorpe helped to arrange the passports.
I'm not sure if it was Robbie Thorpe. It was a young Palestinian woman whose name I can't remember, but she acted in concert with...
I see the passport you're talking about. Thank you, Joseph, for clarifying that. I was talking about the Aboriginal ones.
Yeah, he was working with another event. And on the day of the first Aboriginal passport ceremony at the settlement in Redfern, he handed over the passports to a Palestinian activist representative who took them over to occupied Palestine and the Palestinian refugee camps in Lebanon.
So you're talking more about the internationalist work, which is very important, and it's very pertinent, isn't it, to all his work?
It is. It was very, and if you like, he could see the connections that have now been solidified, say, between the Black Lives Matter movement in the US, which has now also become a transnational movement, and Indigenous Deaths in Custody, And, for example, when the young Dunghutti warrior died in custody in Long Bay Jail, David Dungay, and I know we've talked about this previously on your program, and representatives of his family have talked about his appalling death in custody. The horrific video, which we can still see because his family wanted it released to show the graphic violence of how this young Indigenous man was killed. When we were at the opening of the coronial inquest in Sydney at the law courts there in Elizabeth Street, Hawke Newsom, who's one of the leaders of the Black Lives Matter movement, stood up front and expressed solidarity with the family and with Indigenous deaths in custody. And you can see then how Uncle Ray was the sort of person who, if he had been alive then, he would have seized the moment and really worked those sorts of transnational solidarities, because you could see that we needed to connect the dots, the transnational dots, by which the settler state reproduces itself in various locations in the killing of people of colour, black people and Indigenous people.
Indeed, and look, my contact with Uncle Ray Jackson is obviously only a very small part of his work, and it's all interconnected. I mean, Joseph, you've actually made some really important points there in regards to the history, in regards to the foundational work that he did when he was on the wharves and, at Port Phillip, and, so having solidarity with the workers, isn't it? Uncle Ray was actually a very important part of the Doin Time show. And even before me, I mean, Charitiv Singh used to be a part of the show before. He was a former presenter. And I used to hear these really long interviews with Uncle. And then later, I met him at the People's Hearing, and he was coming in by phone once a week to talk about all the very topics that you've been discussing here on the show, Joseph.
Yeah. Look, he had an extraordinary grasp of both the complex legal cases but also the human dimension. And so, for example, if you went to his small one-bedroom unit, really that was his office, his study and his archive.
Oh. Yeah.
And you couldn't move in there precisely because of all the files that he kept on all the Indigenous deaths in custody cases. And the extraordinary thing is, yes, they were there in paper form and some material was on the computer, but he actually held everything in his head and he knew every single case in all of its details. So he had an extraordinary forensic grasp, but he also had a profoundly human understanding of the traumatic work he was dealing with. So, one of the most memorable things for me about Uncle Ray is when he held the rallies to offer support to Indigenous families who had lost their loved ones in the violence of a death in custody, he would always make the space for members of the family to take the floor and to speak to their loss. And often, they were reluctant to speak because they were so traumatised about the loss. But what Uncle Ray would do, he would allow them the moment to be on stage and just to grieve in silence as a collective, or alternatively, for them to shout their rage and anger over the injustice that they had experienced over the loss of their loved one. So you can see that there was a profound understanding of exactly what was at stake. Not only the legal forensic understanding that he took to those courts, that he took to the coronial inquest, that he took to the police, etc., to pursue justice, but also to try and establish spaces so that people who would normally not be heard, because they are not given media platforms in this country largely, the families of people who have lost loved ones in custody, he would give them public platforms to be there and to speak to their loss.
It's interesting you should say that because, one of the things that Uncle Ray really talked about quite a lot and was quite outraged was about TJ Hickey.
Yeah.
And I do a show about TJ every every year on the 14th of February, and as you know, there's a march there about him.
Yeah.
And TJ Hickey's mother, Gail, really trusted Uncle. The families trusted him. They trusted him with all their files, didn't they? And, you know, he would attend every inquest and even death scene sometimes.
Absolutely. And the TJ Hickey case was particularly fraught and explosive, as you know, because we know that police killed him. And so the police were really always trying to use intimidatory tactics against Uncle Ray and ISJA and the Hickey family to try and stop them from staging those shaming public rallies. So I call them shaming rallies precisely because they were never silent about who the perpetrators of that killing were, the police. But again, Uncle Ray would lead these rallies fearlessly, even as he often faced really quite gross tactics of intimidation from the police. And as you say, Gail Hickey absolutely entrusted him with trying to achieve justice for TJ, because she knew that if anyone could deliver, it was Uncle Ray. Absolutely, and he actually quoted here in an article that I wrote quite some years ago now. I think it was around about 2007 in regards to TJ Hickey's death, and his quote was, "The family and I do not see TJ's death as an accident. It will never happen." Yeah, absolutely. And that's where he was completely uncompromising. And look, you know, here are the things that we can connect. That uncompromising pursuit for justice, but also his expansive vision of people who had been victims of state violence. And, you know, let's talk about the Veronica Baxter case, for example. You know, the young Indigenous transgender woman who basically was thrown in a jail and identified as a woman, was in the process of transitioning. She was on hormone treatment. And as you know, she, as a woman, as an Indigenous woman, she was thrown into an all-men's jail. She was denied hormone treatment, to the outrage of Uncle Ray and her family. And he was absolutely, again, fearless in pursuing this. And when the coronial inquiry handed down its findings, of course, like every single coronial inquiry into Indigenous deaths in custody, no one was referred for prosecution. And again, I want to quote Uncle Ray because I've got a powerful quote. So basically, the police, the prison guards, everyone else who had been complicit in the killing, really, of Veronica Baxter was let off scot-free. And this is what Uncle Ray said in his characteristically uncompromising way. And I quote, this is Uncle Ray, "This inquiry was a sham. It did not resolve how she died. We saw a whitewash on the 20th anniversary of the Royal Commission into Black Deaths in Custody. After the farce of this inquiry, we then saw censorship of the like I've never seen before in my 20 years of Black Deaths in Custody campaigning. Precisely because a gag motion was issued to suppress any information that could be made public about the inquiry." End of quote. So you can see how he'd taken up that cause, but also exposed the absolute farce of these coronial inquiries, where basically it looks as though justice is going to be done. It looks as though justice is going to be delivered for the families, but in fact it never is. It's just really, as he says, a sham whereby procedural law is unfolded without any justice outcome, because in all of the coronial inquiries that have been held into Indigenous deaths in custody, and we can't repeat this enough, no one has ever been referred for prosecution, charged, let alone convicted of the murder of Indigenous people in custody. Absolutely. And Joseph, I want to thank you so much for talking about Uncle and talking about also the historical context. Are there any final comments that you wanted to make about Uncle? Look, there's just such a sense of loss at not having him, as you can imagine. And I know we all get a bit emotional when we name that, but it has to be named. And just the other day, I was speaking to Carl Hughes, the forensic pathologist that worked with Uncle Ray, and he said that he's still grieving 7 years down the track. And, I understand that, and I can only imagine what Carolyn and the larger family feel at that loss. But the other thing is, I want to thank you for continuing to honour his memory at every anniversary. And really, I know that Uncle Ray would sort of, in his really dry, humorous way, say, well, I'm not interested in the honouring. I want you to get on and do the work.
That's exactly right. But this is part of the work, isn't it? And look, I'll be honest with you, Joseph. I'll be honest with you. This show nearly didn't go ahead today. It's, we've had a tough couple of years. There's a pandemic in progress. There's a lot going on, and I'm only guided by Carolyn, and she said, no, let it go ahead, and we both came to the conclusion we'll do a 2-part series. We'll have Joseph be the guest today, and that will be, the springboard, the continuing the work and introducing today, isn't it?
Yeah, it is, and then Carolyn and Bronwyn can really take up the cudgels and
Serge as well, yeah. I'm hoping. Yeah.
And Sergio, yeah, exactly.
Sergio. Yeah. Look, just one last thing that I wanted to mention on a personal level about Uncle Ray, and that is I actually, sometimes I will pick up the phone to call him. I've still got all his old emails, and like last month I was actually looking through some of his emails, and his phone number was at the bottom, and I actually picked up the phone to dial the number.
I can understand that.
And then I thought, hang on a minute, Marisa, what are you doing?
Isn't that a tribute to how connected he was to the people he befriended and worked with, that we still can do that, and we sense that sense of connectedness even after years of his passing?
Absolutely. I mean, he was part of the collective. He was part of the collective, the Doin Time show. Like, there were times when I was having a look at my diary, prior, because I still keep all my old diaries, and he was there once a week at one stage for about 6 months. He'd be on the show. It was like he was part of us.
Oh, he was. He's part of our life's fabric, effectively.
All of us. Yeah.
Yeah. But look, in terms of doing the work and the question, the issue of honour, I do want to leave you with this, because it's a wonderful line that I've never forgotten. As you know, he had a great sense of humour. When I first nominated him for the French Human Rights Award, he was contacted by the French consul here because they started the process, and he rang me up and he said, "Is this a joke?" Because he couldn't quite believe that a government body was finally going to acknowledge his extraordinary social justice achievements.
See, that's really...
Yeah, because, he knew that all he had got was, a kick in the teeth from state, federal, local governments here. They never acknowledged, let alone rewarded, his extraordinary work. But when he was awarded it, this is the wonderful line that he spoke to me. He was incredibly moved because it meant so much to him, because they got about 30,000 euros for ISJA to continue their Indigenous Deaths in custody work. But he said to me, "You know what this award means to me? It means I've got one more hammer to smash down the doors." Isn't that a wonderful quote? One more hammer to smash down the doors in order to get through towards social justice.
Absolutely.
So that's the legacy that Uncle Ray has left us.
It is a very important legacy, and I think I do need to mention as well, just so that for the purposes of listeners as well, that Uncle Ray was able to really talk about the autopsies in detail. Sometimes we have very harrowing information on this show. I don't, people don't realise, I think, sometimes, until they listen, what this show is about. That it's about not just looking at deaths in custody, but looking at colonisation and what happens in the police cells, what happens in detention centres. I mean, for example, you know, Ray would talk about Mr. Briscoe, he'd talk about Eddie Murray, he would talk about Ms. Dew. But all of those things weren't just talked about in terms of what the media was saying, but he would go a step further and dissect those autopsies with the skill of a medical examiner.
Yeah.
And that's a really important thing to understand, isn't it?
Oh, absolutely. And you know, and that was, again, his fearlessness in actually fighting to achieve that change in the legislation that enabled Indigenous representatives of deaths in custody families to be there. And often they would entrust that responsibility to him because they knew they could trust him, and he would make sure that the body of the loved one was treated with the utmost respect. Even as I said, it would have been a really harrowing process to watch because he wasn't a trained forensic pathologist, but he endured that for the sake of doing the right thing for the family and the person who had passed.
Absolutely. And this is 3CR Community Radio, and I am speaking on the unceded lands of the Kulin Nation, and that's where this interview was conducted, and indeed this episode is being conducted right now. Although the show hasn't been aired on the 23rd of April, right on the anniversary. We've had a couple of public holidays, but we've done our best, and we will be airing it on this Monday. Joe, thank you very much. Joseph.
You're welcome, Marisa, and really happy to see that you continue this wonderful tradition of honouring Uncle Ray, his life work and his ongoing legacy. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and you take care of yourself, Joseph.
Yep, you too. All the best. Bye-bye.
All the best. Thanks a lot. Bye-bye.
You're listening to 3CR Community Radio 855 AM on digital and online. 3CR Radical Radio.
And you're back with the Doin Time show. And this is 3CR Community Radio, 855 AM on the dial, streaming live on www.3cr.org.au. And this is a special broadcast in case listeners have just tuned in. And it's a tribute to Uncle Ray Jackson, who died on the 23rd of April 2015. And we just heard from Joseph Pugliese, who is a friend of Ray Jackson, and indeed has written several books about state violence. And there is a book launch that he's actually has on Thursday night at 8 o'clock about his book, Mapping Deathscapes. So please Google that and see if you can attend that. That's 8 o'clock Melbourne and Sydney time. Now, I just wanted to spend just a little bit of time, we've only got about 5 minutes left, in regards to just talking a little bit more about Uncle Ray. And I might just read out just a little bit of an article that it's a very powerful piece, actually. It's called Talk Loud, Talk Strong, and it's from Borderlands, and it's a tribute to Aboriginal leader Uncle Ray Jackson, 1941 to 2015. And it says that it is fitting that this Borderlands special issue dedicated to the politics of human suffering include a tribute to the Wiradjuri leader Uncle Ray Jackson. By the end of his life, Uncle Ray Jackson remained a tireless fighter for Australian and other First Nations peoples and an uncompromising internationalist and socialist, holding up a mirror to settler colonialist violence in all its national and global ramifications. And so, just going on with that, his Indigenous Social Justice Association, ISJA, led many courageous campaigns against Aboriginal and other racialised deaths in custody, holding state institutions to account and supporting the families of the bereaved. Over 4 decades, through both his activism and his writing, Uncle Ray Jackson insisted on and developed the linkages between justice for Aboriginal peoples and a range of other social movements such as Black Power and anti-apartheid, prison abolition, trade unionism and socialism. The tributes paid to him by figures such as Angela Davis and John Pilger testify to this indispensable globalist dimension that framed his life and work. Grounded in the assertion of Aboriginal sovereignty, Uncle Ray Jackson produced a series of astute and uncompromising analyses of the instances of colonial and state violence detailed throughout this special issue, the invasion of Gaza and the ongoing dispossession and occupation of Palestinian lands, the war in Sri Lanka, and the continuing stream of refugees it produced, the relentless toll of the war on terror, and unfolded the geopolitical and economic order that underpins them. His analyses were accompanied by an unswerving commitment to and solidarity with those who bore the worst effects of this violence, racialised peoples incarcerated in prisons and onshore and offshore immigration detentions, the families of those killed in sites of official state custody and its hidden shadows and cracks, those dispossessed and disenfranchised by the forms, geopolitical and neoliberal violence. He documented in meticulous detail. An open letter to them, the Prime Minister Kevin Rudd, written in 2013, tracks the logic by which the occupation of Aboriginal land led to the xenophobic policies and practices directed towards present-day refugees and asylum seekers. The invasion of the Aboriginal nations that began in January 1788 continues to this day, but after time it also allowed under statute a xenophobic and racist law that was used against my peoples and immigrants, refugees, especially if they were not white, in a social understanding. And that was a quote, actually, Ray Jackson, open letter to Kevin Rudd, MP, August the 5th, 2013. So we've only got a couple of minutes left off the show, but I thought I'd actually read that very small piece of the article. Do Google it. It's from Borderlands, and it's actually really good reading. But I didn't just read it for the sake of reading. I actually read that because I believe that that's quite a pertinent summary of what we talked about on the show today. So this show was very different to other shows that I have broadcasted over the many years since Ray Jackson passed away. This show really looked at the historical context of Uncle Ray's work, and Joseph was the only guest. But I want to make it clear to listeners that although he was the only guest, we will be having Indigenous interviewees in 2 weeks, and that this is actually a two-part series of the first one of it has been aired already. It's a two-part series of the passing of Ray Jackson and a tribute to the passing of Ray Jackson and looking at his life's work, and it's basically a celebration to honour his work. So it's goodbye from Marisa. It really has been an extremely emotional time for me today, and, you know, it was really difficult to witness Carolyn Jackson's poor health, and I'm hoping that she's in a better place. I wanted to send out a cheerio to both Carolyn and Joseph, and also to Bronwyn as well, Professor Bronwyn Carlson as well, and we'll see if we can invite her onto the show in 2 weeks' time. And, you know, we're all going through a very difficult time at the moment, and thank you so much to everybody who is going to be has contributed and will be contributing to the two-part series of Uncle Ray Jackson. And I can only be guided by others. That's what this show's about. It's all about, you know, providing a safe environment for not just First Nations people, but people from marginalised communities and the most vulnerable. And I'll leave you with that thought. Stay strong and take care of each other. And we'll be going out now with our theme song, Black Fella, White Fella by the Warumpi Band. Stay tuned every Monday from 4 till 5 for the Doin Time show. Bye.
As long as you a true fella, as long as you a real fella. All the people of different races with different lives in Are you the one who's always ready with a helping hand? Are you the one who understands this family plan? Are you the one who's always ready with a helping hand?
You've been listening to a 3CR podcast produced in the studios of independent community radio station 3CR in Melbourne, Australia. For more information, go to allthews.3cr.org.au.